Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age podcast. Bonus episode, Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra. Few figures in history can claim the star power of Cleopatra VII. Between literature, theater, painting, sculpture, cinema, cartoons, comics, and video games, you would be hard-pressed to find a woman who is as popular a subject as the last independent queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Wikipedia page for a list of cultural depictions of Cleopatra turns up over 150 entries, and there are at least 8 feature-length movies that go solely by the name Cleopatra, and a 9th one was just announced to be in production as of 2020. But the most famous, or infamous depiction can be found in the 1963 film Cleopatra, a 4-hour epic starring Elizabeth Taylor playing as the titular character. As of late, I've been going back to the golden age of Hollywood to visit the great epics about the ancient world, and sat down to watch Cleopatra over a period of 2 days. While we are some ways from covering the final days of Hellenistic Egypt, I thought it would be a fun title to talk about. Considering my well-spoken love of the Oliver Stone Alexander movie, it was high time that I took a look at the other great epic film about the Hellenistic period, and maybe explore the challenges that are faced with portraying such a complex character. I, of course, would be remiss to talk about Cleopatra without giving context to the film's production history, which is notorious for being one of the most disastrous and troubling in the history of cinema. There are many excellent books, articles, and documentaries that outline the full story, which I will link to in the episode notes, so my overview is going to be a bit more cursory. Production began in the late 1950s as 20th Century Fox was struggling to find their next big hit after years of little success. A remake of the 1917 silent film Cleopatra was proposed by producer Walter Wanger, who considered it a pet project, and a modest budget of a few $1,000,000 would be given to director Rouben Mamoulian after approval. Filming was to take place at Pinewood Studios in Iver, England, where the sets would be built to replicate Egypt and Rome, including shipping in shrubbery and palm trees on a constant basis to match with the warmer climate. As to who was to play the part of Cleopatra, many actresses were suggested or even screen tested as the leading lady, but Wanger sought to cast famed actress Elizabeth Taylor, who was paid a then staggering $1 million plus 10% gross. According to rumor, she expressed little interest in the project and threw out the figure thinking that the studio wouldn't accept it. Turns out they did, making her the highest paid actress of her day. Unfortunately, this came with baggage. She was a controversial figure, her multiple marriages making tabloid headlines, and was plagued with chronic health issues throughout most of her life, including an addiction to alcohol and painkillers, which would complicate matters. Issues began immediately. The choice to shoot in England came with dreary weather that hampered the production, and in conjunction with Taylor's illnesses, including a bout of meningitis, the film's budget had entirely been eaten through by November of that year, with only 10 minutes of usable footage produced. In spite of a complete script overhaul, Mamoulian resigned in January of 1961 and was replaced by Joseph L. Mankiewicz as director. He worked with Taylor before and had her approval, and by now they found 2 male actors to play the other lead roles. Veteran actor Rex Harrison was cast as Julius Caesar, and Richard Burton would play Mark Antony. However, the cold spring weather of March contributed to Taylor nearly dying from pneumonia, and her resulting tracheotomy scar can be prominently seen in many shots of her during the film. Deciding to abandon England, production was moved to Rome, and Mankiewicz spent many agonizing months coming up with yet another massive rewrite of a script now approaching 300 pages. The biggest drama came in the spring of 1962 when the Italian paparazzi released images that revealed an affair between Taylor and Burton, which caused a scandal at home and even outrage from the Vatican, though, no doubt, it probably gave the film great publicity. After much trial and tribulation, principal photography would be completed in July of 1962. The sheer volume of film was impressive, as Mankiewicz intended to release the nearly 6 hours of filming across 2 separate movies. This was put a stop to by the new president of Fox, Darryl Zanuck, who ordered that the film be heavily edited down and released as just a single picture. Zanuck's interference produced a film that was heavily shaved down to just 3 hours and 15 minutes, to the outrage of both the director and Taylor herself. At the end of it all, the movie ended up costing Fox somewhere between $30 to $40 million to make, and when adjusted for inflation, it comes to $300 million to $400 million today. This is over 6 times the original budget, and there are rumors that expenses were even higher than that. For perspective, the 1959 epic Ben-Hur, starring Charlton Heston, cost about $15 million at the time of production. And despite Cleopatra being a hit among audiences who flocked to the theaters to watch it, and made it the #1 grossing movie of 1963, the studio was on the verge of collapse, seemingly unable to recoup its losses. It was only due to the outrageous success of The Sound of Music in 1965 that Fox was able to regain its former footing, and to many, it was responsible for the death of the studio system that dominated Hollywood since the 20s. Though film buffs clamor for the director's cut, the closest we can get to Mankiewicz's vision is the 50th anniversary release from 2013, which clocks in at 4 hours and 11 minutes, including the intermission, and this is the version that I have watched. Rather than covering Cleopatra from her childhood, the film begins in 48 BC, just following the victory of Julius Caesar over the forces of Pompey at Pharsalus. Caesar then chases Pompey to Alexandria, where he is received by the child pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, before having his famous encounter with Cleopatra via a rolled-up carpet. As civil war grips the city, the pair grow more intimate, and after she is declared sole ruler, they conceive a child together, named Caesarion. Caesar himself is drawn away to handle the rest of the Pompeian forces over the next few years, until Cleopatra follows him to Rome in 45, where she enters the city in a grand display and attracts the ire of other Roman senators. The first half concludes with Caesar's assassination, and the queen flees back to Egypt under the cover of night once it's revealed that Caesarion was not recognized as heir, choosing instead his nephew, Octavian, played by Roddy McDowall. The second half starts in the aftermath of the Battle of Philippi, where Antony gathers resources to plan his invasion of Parthia. After much hesitation, Cleopatra sails to Tarsus to meet with Antony, and manages to seduce the great general and begins their romance. Politicking forces Antony to leave Egypt and marry Octavian's sister, much to Cleopatra's rage, and only after his subsequent emasculation does she accept him back into her good graces. This betrayal by Antony causes Octavian to conspire against the pair, sufficiently angering the Senate and leading to a declaration of war on Egypt. The Battle of Actium takes center stage, whereupon Cleopatra flees in her ship in the mistaken belief that Antony was killed in the fight. Depressed and drowning his sorrows in wine over his loss, Antony reluctantly returns to confront the forces of Octavian after Cleopatra motivates him enough to do so. Nevertheless, Antony's men abandon him, and after being denied a death on the battlefield, he runs himself through with his sword in Alexandria, when told that Cleopatra had already perished. However, it turns out not to be the case, as Antony is carried to a large tomb where she was seeking refuge, and promptly dies in her arms. After a final meeting with Octavian, who claims that she would be able to rule as a vassal of Rome, the queen decides to take her own life, rather than being displayed in triumph, and dies to the bite of an asp. The final shot of the film is of her dressed in her iconic golden winged outfit, laid out on the slab in regal fashion, and the credits begin to roll as Octavian and his men look on in both amazement and disbelief. How does it stand in terms of its overall authenticity? The film itself was inspired primarily by the biography The Life and Times of Cleopatra by Carlo Maria Cranzaro, but its title card also explicitly states that it is based on the writings of Plutarch, Suetonius, and Appian. I think that this claim is genuine, as there are scenes and references that appear to be pulled straight out of those works. There are, of course, liberties taken with names and dates. For instance, Augustus's right-hand man, Marcus Agrippa, is portrayed as an aged veteran commander of Julius Caesar during the Civil War, where in reality he was only about 15 to 16 at the time. The birth and youth of Caesarion is accounted for, but there is no mention of Cleopatra's 3 other children she had with Mark Antony. Octavian Caesar is even shown killing one of Cleopatra's envoys with a spear while in Rome, something that would have been almost sacrilegious and completely made up. Much of this can be tied to the process of filmmaking and creative liberties or limitations of the story they were trying to tell. I don't really want to go down a checklist of all the major and minor historical accuracies, but I want to talk about the film's overall presentation, focusing on what I liked or didn't like. In terms of set design, no expense was spared. Two major sets were built, one representing Alexandria and the other the Roman Forum. Hellenistic Alexandria, for the most part, I was quite pleased with. Rather than looking like a stereotypical Egyptian city, we instead see predominantly Greek architecture that is accented by Egyptian motifs and designs. Some of it is a little more exaggerated when it comes to interior shots in terms of its Egyptianness, such as the overabundance of hieroglyphs on the walls of the palace, but other elements like sphinxes and obelisks are attested to by literary and archaeological evidence as being present in Alexandria's cityscape. This is definitely much better than the Alexandria presented in HBO's Rome, which reflects a city that is more at home with the New Kingdom designs of the Prince of Egypt or even the Mummy. There are also two life-size models of ships, one being Cleopatra's pleasure barge and the other being Antony's ship during the Battle of Actium. Again, the production quality is truly impressive, making it feel very believable to see the ship sailing out of the harbor. Costume-wise, they are very anachronistic in their designs. Romans look quintessentially Roman to varying degrees of accuracy, whereas Cleopatra and her court are clearly wearing quote-unquote Egyptian outfits rather than more Greek ones. This is a bit of a disappointment compared to how nicely Alexandria was balanced, but I imagine that the choice was made to visually distinguish the two groups, and also emphasize the exotic nature of the Ptolemies, probably rooted in the imagery of Orientalist paintings from the 19th century, artists like Alexandre Cabanel or Jean-Léon Gérôme. However, I cannot say anything bad about the number and quality of the costumes themselves. Cleopatra has 65 individual costume changes alone, the most extravagant being her golden winged outfit worn on her entrance to Rome, and several different hairstyles and wigs. Seeing how colorfully the cast and extras were dressed was an absolute treat, especially compared to modern Hollywood's tendency to use extremely simple palettes like browns and beiges in movies about the ancient world. Despite the number of hair pieces she has, I do find it a bit of a bummer that Cleopatra never once has her hair up in a bun, outside of a bathtub scene, nor does she wear the royal diadem, something associated with almost every ancient depiction of a Ptolemaic queen, and Cleopatra in particular. Her famous braided wigs are reminiscent of the more Egyptianized statues of Ptolemaic rulers, and she is shown wearing the pschent, the double crown symbolizing the Upper and Lower Egypt, during her coronation as queen by Caesar. From the time of Ptolemy V, Ptolemaic kings would often be coronated according to Egyptian custom, so there is a grain of truth to the idea, though whether Cleo would be dressed up in such a traditionally masculine garb is unknown. Speaking of which, we now come to the portrayal of Cleopatra herself. I think there are a few key points that the film tries to make, and how that is shaped by the perception of Cleopatra as a historical figure. Firstly, her sexuality and romance with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. The fact that the filmmakers focus so heavily on her love life is not really surprising, given that much of what we know about Cleopatra is derived from ancient authors who wrote about her in relation to the actions of powerful men like Caesar. The real Cleopatra was a woman who was reportedly modest-looking in terms of her physical appearance, but her charming personality and education are cited as her most attractive features. Elizabeth Taylor, a Hollywood bombshell renowned for her good looks, has multiple scenes where she is dressed in clothing that accentuates her curves or where her sex appeal is blatantly played up, such as her bathtub scene or where she lies naked under her sheets when talking to Caesar. Her sexuality is used as a weapon to disarm or persuade her paramours, which leans more into the Augustan propaganda of her as an Eastern temptress, though the film indulges in it very willingly. I will say that they do make reference to her ability to speak other languages, albeit a passing one, and she has a scene where she is emotionally distraught over the damage to the Library of Alexandria, alluding to her learned background. However, Taylor's sexually charged portrayal is the model for Cleopatra in pop culture. something that has not changed much after nearly 60 years for both better and worse. When it comes to the connection with her two lovers, I think this is where the film is lopsided. The romance between Cleopatra and Caesar is by far the most interesting part of the movie. Rex Harrison does a phenomenal job as the Roman politician, probably one of the best portrayals of the man in cinema. Their connection is wonderful, as every scene they appear together feels like a battle of wits, which I think effectively heightens the obvious sexual tension between the two and presents more of an equal dynamic. The relationship between Cleopatra and Mark Antony is the focus of the rest of the movie, going through the motions from the meeting at Tarsus to their suicides following the loss at Actium. Though Burton and Taylor's whirlwind romance made headlines, their supposed chemistry is not really captured on the screen. Antony is portrayed as a pathetic drunk, completely at the mercy to Cleopatra's allure, and half the time Burton's acting feels incredibly flat and depressed. This is no doubt in part to contrast him with Caesar, presenting Antony as submissive to the whims of the queen, whereas Caesar was more of a dominant partner. Such a motif was used by the ancient authors themselves, keen to write about Antony always being second to Caesar in everything, from military command to sexual conquests. Reportedly, some of Burton's best scenes were cut from the film, so some blame must be taken off his shoulders. Still, he is far less interesting to watch than the Antony portrayed by James Purefoy in HBO's Rome, and I still maintain that he is the weakest main cast member. As part of her sexual allure, the filmmakers focused heavily on Cleopatra's opulence. Everything about her portrayal is larger than life, and I think this is a pretty smart angle to go with for a visual medium, though perhaps to the dismay of the film's financiers. The Ptolemaic kingdom was characterized by luxury and decadent living, partially a result of stereotyping, but no doubt was conscious in their own presentation. The numerous costume changes, her several attendants of various ethnic backgrounds, including a woman of East Asian origin, as unlikely as that to be, and constant displays of wealth are ever present. Perhaps the most famous scene of the movie is Cleopatra's entrance into Rome, a spectacle lasting nearly 10 minutes featuring thousands of extras, including multiple dancers, horse riders, and a giant black sphinx pulled by her attendants, all done without the use of CGI. While there is no evidence of such a display during the real Cleopatra's arrival in 45 BC, the scale of it is highly reminiscent of the grand pomp of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and probably will be the closest thing to it we will see on the screen. It is rather fitting that a character so renowned for her wealth is the focus of a film that is held up as the premier example of Hollywood excess. Another key trait of hers is ambition and pride. Cleopatra is certainly haughty, befitting her status as the last in line of 300 years of kings and queens, and is quite ruthless to maintain and gain power. She uses her beauty and genuine attraction to Rome's most powerful men to place herself in the seemingly most advantageous position, though to varying degrees of success, and ultimately fails in her attempt. It's classic tragedy, and the romance angle certainly plays the part. A recurring notion is her insistence that she was the earthly embodiment of the goddess Isis. Ptolemaic queens were often associated with Isis, but Cleopatra is said to have been especially conscious of doing so, going so far as to make public appearances with robes that were sacred to the goddess. One scene that I think is especially revealing of her character, even if it's intended to convince Caesar to side with her more than anything else, is her speech in front of the tomb of Alexander the Great about his dreams of a unified world empire. This is based on Alexander's supposed brotherhood of mankind philosophy, argued by the likes of W. W. Tarn, and even present in the Oliver Stone Alexander film, which has problems in of itself, but clearly indicates that she was also sharing the same vision of empire. I do like that the film doesn't necessarily make her a patriotic Egyptian in the face of Roman oppressors. It's clear that her interest is entirely self-serving and based on a dynastic claim to power ruling over the native Egyptians, and her base of power is Greek in identity. Caesar even makes a snippy comment about her being the product of generations of inbred Macedonians when she speaks of her semi-divine nature, though she fires back about his own supposed divine ancestry to Venus. This pride is consistent throughout the very end of the story, where she commits suicide rather than being humiliated in Octavian's triumph. What are my final thoughts on Cleopatra? In comparison to contemporary historical epics like Ben-Hur or Spartacus, I think it falls rather short. The first half is superior by far, but as we meander through the second half, I found myself staring at my phone quite a bit, even considering the big set piece of Actium. Taylor herself, I think, does a reasonably good job at playing the Cleopatra that the creators had in mind, but this version of Cleopatra is not necessarily what I would consider to be a good reflection of the real-life queen. Harrison's Caesar is masterful, but Burton was a poor choice for Antony. Evidence suggests that the second half of the film was mangled in editing, and while I am genuinely curious to see what the director's original vision was like, the weight of its length was at times overwhelming, even when spreading it out over 2 days. However, the artistry of the costume and set designers is on full display, and I was genuinely impressed by the scale of things captured on screen with only the use of practical effects. I would say that it is worth at least one watch if you're remotely interested. It created the model of Cleopatra that has dominated pop culture for over half a century, making it an essential part of classical reception studies. Its production value remains impressive to this day, representative of a long-gone era before the over-reliance of CGI. But it is also a victim of its own reputation, the troubled production history being at times far more interesting than the actual movie itself, making it more of a historical curiosity than as a cinematic experience. How would I go about this to make it better? Really, I think the main problem is that Cleopatra, and more specifically her romantic relationships, has been done to death. There are dozens of other royal ladies of the Hellenistic period whose lives would make excellent dramas, yet studios keep returning to her story over and over again. In 2020, it was announced that yet another new Cleopatra film starring actress Gal Gadot was in the works, and as of early 2025, they picked Morocco for principal photography. I'm not terribly excited because we'll probably just have the same gripes of portraying Cleopatra as we've had before. On top of everything, a more notable issue that has come to the forefront is the race of the actresses who are to play her. In 2023, Netflix released a documentary on Cleopatra that attracted a great deal of online controversy due to the casting of Adele James, a black actress, and for comments made by some of the documentary's participants who claimed that Cleopatra herself was a black woman. Conversely, there were also accusations of whitewashing when Gal Gadot was picked for her film. So the matter of who owns the character and the difference between historical accuracy versus historical authenticity when it comes to portraying the ancient world in media has become a pretty big topic of discussion as of late. Would I love to see other films veer away from Cleopatra or even Alexander the Great? Of course, the Hellenistic world is chock full of figures who would be worth taking a look at. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to leave Cleopatra behind anytime soon, and there are a myriad of reasons why film producers will continue to flock to her. Firstly, her marketing power. Cleopatra is a household name, and when you think of Cleopatra, almost nobody thinks about the 6 other royal ladies who carried that name before her. 2, she is associated with other prominent figures like Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and Augustus, some of the most well-known of all Roman history. Third, because her relationships with these men were the focus of authors from Plutarch to William Shakespeare, modern writers are keen to draw upon these earlier traditions for ease of storytelling. Almost certainly they have demographics in mind, so if you're able to cross genres between historical action and romance, then you have a wider audience base to draw upon. Fourth, from a production standpoint, studios can and will use pre-existing assets like costumes and sets to cover ancient Rome and ancient Egypt, which could save on cost and time in spite of any historical anachronism that this may cause. Trying to capture the quote-unquote real Cleopatra is also something that is not going to be achieved by Hollywood for the reasons I listed above, and because of the nature of our sources. People will have different ideas about who Cleopatra was and what aspects of her character to emphasize. Do you play up her sexuality and romantic entanglements with Caesar and Antony as this film did? Is she more of a feminist icon, a strong-willed queen who was a victim of Roman imperialism? Or was she just an overly ambitious political gambler and heir to a floundering dynasty who exploited Egypt's wealth for centuries? These are all possible interpretations, but I think that we would be best served by looking to other persons for a fresh take on the ancient and Hellenistic worlds, when If ever this will happen is not so clear, but one can always dream.